give way for other members to talk about
I call the meeting to order. Good afternoon. We are about to get started. So if I can call the meeting to order. Excellencies, distinguished delegates, greetings from Geneva. We are pleased to meet you here again this afternoon in Geneva in the ATT meeting conducted in a hybrid format. To introduce myself, my name is Dumisani Dladla. I am the head of the ATT Secretariat, which is located here in Geneva, the seat of the ATT Secretariat. Before we commence with the proceedings of today, I would like to take this opportunity to inform you of the housekeeping rules that we will ask you to observe for this meeting and for other meetings tomorrow so that we can have a smooth run of the meetings. With respect to interpretation, please be advised that interpretation into all UN languages is available during the meetings. For those of you participating remotely, if you look at the bottom of your screen, you will see a button marked interpretation. If you select this, you will have 6 language options. Click on the language that you would like to listen to. If you do not select a language, you will hear all presentations and statements in the language in which they are delivered. You can also mute the original language by tapping the mute original audio in Zoom. For those in the room, the button to select the language you want are the 3rd and 4th buttons on the base of the microphone in front of you. Regarding the speakers list, there is no speakers list that has been prepared in advance. So when the time for discussions come, if you want to make a statement, you can indicate by using the chat function, or if you are in the conference room, you can raise your name plate. We will call on persons who have asked for the floor in the order that they request the floor. If you are giving a statement on behalf of your government or organization, turn on the microphone when you are called upon to speak. Please point the microphone towards your mouth so that we can get the audio right. If you are participating remotely, you'll also be requested to turn on your camera. For those of you participating via the Zoom platform, please ensure that the microphones are off during the meeting, and we are making a special call for those who are connecting to this meeting using their mobile phones. Please do not use the chat function to address everyone for any purpose other than addressing your communication to the ATT Secretariat. And we request that you do not write questions in the chat functions for everyone. If you have a question to ask, please ask for the floor and direct the question to everyone in the room. So it's best if you address the conference or the meeting as opposed to doing so through the chat function. For those of you participating in person in the conference room here at the CICG, please ensure that there is only 1 person per desk and you respect social distancing, 1.5 meters in between. So put differently, there needs to be a seat between each and every delegate present here. So we would insist on that as part of our commitments to the protocol. Please wear the mask at all times, even when you are seated. And we'll ask delegates not to move around a lot, only to move around if it is necessary to do so. And if you have a question to the Secretariat, you can address it to the Secretariat via the chat function. But of course, if it is urgent, you can still walk to the Secretariat to get attention. Regarding the printing of documents, the Secretariat here does not have the printing facility on our desk, but you can use the reception desk where you can print whatever document you want at cost though. These are the housekeeping rules I wanted to inform this meeting about. Having done so, I would like to take this opportunity to introduce the President of the 8th Conference of States Parties, Ambassador Thomas Gubel of Germany, to open this meeting. Mr. President, over to you.
Thank you very much, and also thank you for preparing so perfectly this meeting under still very difficult circumstances. So, Excellencies, distinguished delegates, ladies and gentlemen, it's a great pleasure to welcome all representatives of the ATT states parties, signatory states, other states, civil society and industry, to this first day of the ATT hybrid meetings planned for this week. We are encouraged by the number of representatives present here today and those who will participate in this meeting online from different geographic locations. I'm optimistic that the meeting planned for the week will further enable participants to exchange views and share experiences on our efforts to advance the ATT universalization and implementation objectives. Ladies and gentlemen, the 7th Conference of State Parties held in August last year decided, amongst others, that an informal preparatory process should be established for the 8th Conference of State Parties planned for from 22 to 26 August this year. The ATT meetings taking place this week was as announced in November last year, and the format confirmed in January of this year form part of the informal process organized to provide all ATT stakeholders the opportunity to participate meaningfully in preparations for the forthcoming 8th Conference of State Parties. You will recall that the 3rd Conference of State Parties held in September 2017 established 3 standing ATT working groups to operate under their respective terms of reference. The 3 working groups are the Working Group on Effective Treaty Implementation, the Working Group on Transparency and Reporting, and the Working Group on Treaty Universalization. Since their establishment, the 3 working groups have created a continuous platform for discussions and exchanges on various topics of the treaty with a view to achieving outcomes that assist states in implementing the treaty at a national level. In the week ahead, the 3 working groups will continue facilitating discussions on priority topics for the CSP8 cycle. As you will be aware, the working groups are ably led by the following states. The Working Group on Effective Treaty Implementation is chaired by the Republic of Korea, assisted by 3 facilitators: Spain for Article 6 and 7, South Africa for Article 9, and Serbia for Article 11. The Working Group on Transparency and Reporting is co-chaired by the Netherlands and Panama. The Working Group on Treaty Universalization is co-chaired by Germany, the CSP8 presidency, and Sierra Leone, the presidency of the CSP7 cycle. I would take this opportunity to thank all the colleagues, all the office holders for their engagement for the treaty and the support for the presidency. All documents for the meetings this week were circulated by the ATT Secretariat to the ATT community and posted on the ATT website in all languages of the treaty. That means the Arabic, Chinese, English, French, Russian, and Spanish. To facilitate exchange in the planned ATT meetings for the week, it gives me great pleasure to reconfirm that all working group meetings, as well as the informal preparatory meeting on Friday, will enjoy live in-session interpretation as just explained by the Secretariat. In conclusion, I look forward to lively discussions during the working group meetings, and also look forward to receiving the working group's progress report on the CSP8 informal preparatory meeting on Friday. I thank you for your attention, and I would like to invite now the facilitator for the sub-working groups on Article 6 and 7 to commence his work. So, Mr. Ambassador Sanchez-Stellarin, dear Ignacio, you have the floor. Please, I invite you to the podium.
Muchas gracias a todos los presentes y los que están conectados online. Vamos a dar inicio a la sesión de trabajo de los artículos.
Thank you very much. And welcome to everyone who's here in the room and who's following remotely. We will begin assessing Article 6 and 7, specifically two priority matters. In February of 2020, in the last face-to-face meeting we had before this one, I suggested a methodology for best practices with the aim of fulfilling the objective of the CSP. That is, to help in interpreting certain concepts of both these articles, which needed to be elaborated. This methodology of best practices took longer than expected, namely because of COVID. 20 state members only decided to participate in this exercise and submitted their written suggestions. The EU and 3 non-governmental organizations also took part. These submissions were coherent and allowed us to develop a report and to finalize this activity and elaborate on specific concepts. Therefore, today, we will base our work on that report, on the voluntary guide for the implementation of Article 6 and 7. This guidance document, which is addressed to those in charge of implementing the treaty, has a first chapter in which we introduce the main concepts, the concepts that we have worked on in the past. Basically, what we've done is to summarize the report the conference received in this first chapter, which we supplemented with legal references and annexes of the documents to which it refers. In the working document which was distributed, you will find the report which was adopted a year ago, together with those legal references which I just mentioned. Our mandate today is to examine in general terms this first chapter. We don't need to delve into the concepts, into the legal references, but rather stick to the main ideas covered in the first chapter of this guidance document. It's the starting block for the rest of our work. What we've come to call item 5, a voluntary guide. I'd like to, on this matter, offer you the floor to know voluntary guide draft elements of chapter 1 key concepts. I'd like to offer you the floor to know if you have any ideas or suggestions you would like to share.
La delegación de Bélgica tiene la palabra.
Belgium has the floor.
Thank you, Ambassador. Good afternoon to everyone. Thank you also to elaborate this voluntary guide that we already talked about, I think, 2 years ago. Now brings us to a substantive document, which is always easier to comment on than another. I have a few general remarks about that, and then maybe a few remarks of the text that I don't necessarily need to go into now, but could send you on paper also. My first remark concerns what you said earlier about the methodology and the responses that you got to the template. You mentioned that there were, I think, 20 states parties that have provided input. I think it would be good if that would be part of the document, a little bit more explanation about the process, because obviously when in such a voluntary guide, you provide a list of best practices based on a survey of states parties. It's good to know how many responded to that, to see how, to say, it's representative of states parties practice. So because it's less than, just less than 20%, I think. So I think it would be useful to have that in there in general. And another point in that same regard, I remember when we discussed the document for the first time, I think us and a number of others also already pointed out that some of the concepts that are included, they are well established in international law, and by having a document that focuses on interpretations of concepts in the ATT, we should be careful to not reinterpret those in that specific context. And that is why I think it would be useful to also reflect that in the guide itself. So then there are a number of concepts that are already established in international law, have their own definition, and we don't really need to have a particular interpretation in our work here. And in the same line, a third remark was that we noticed some references also to the ICC statute and to the articles on criminal responsibility. I just wanted to point out that obviously in the context of the ATT, we talk about state responsibility and not individual criminal responsibility. And I think we should also be careful not to apply standards or criminal law standards to these provisions in the ATT. Those were three general remarks. Other than that, we had a few very text-based ones, but I don't think it's necessary to go into that now, and can do that later in written context. Thank you.
Muchas gracias a la delegación de Bélgica.
Thank you very much, Belgium. I will now give the floor to everyone who wishes to intervene, and will then respond. WILPF. has the floor.
Thank you.
WLPF.
Thank you, Chair. The Women's International League for Peace and Freedom will focus its remarks on the elements of a voluntary guide to implementing Article 6 and 7 of the ATT. We will first share some thoughts on substance of the current chapter and then offer some remarks on the process and format of the chapter on key concepts in Articles 6 and 7. WILF welcomes the contribution of the draft chapter 1 on key concepts to transparency, as it allows other states parties, as well as civil society, to develop a better understanding of current gaps and weaknesses in national control systems. WILF would therefore consider this exercise as a survey of current state practice and as an entry point to identify weaknesses and to recommend ways to improve and strengthen states parties' application of international law. WILF and other organizations have noted in the past, and that was just reiterated by Belgium as well, that many of the concepts raised for discussion and interpretation via the sub-working group's survey exercise are already well understood and employed within different fields of international law. WILF expresses its continued concern with the content of some of these submissions made in 2021 as part of this activity. To cite just one example, some states parties indicated that when it comes to serious violations of international humanitarian law, they look at the degree of harm to the victims of the violation, at whether the violation is systematically repeated, and at the scale and effects of the violation. Though these concepts clearly all drive at a colloquial understanding of seriousness, these considerations do not form part of the legal definition of serious violations of IHL. The ICRC has conducted extensive legal work to clarify the technical definition of serious violations of IHL. And a serious violation of IHL is one which either endangers protected persons or objects, or which breaches important values. Similarly, the survey reveals some states parties' interpretation of serious acts of gender-based violence. And WILF regrets that some states continue to apply an understanding of GBV in their licensing processes that continues to be unduly narrow and incomplete. This is especially regrettable in light of the existing wealth of resources and the in-depth exchange on the topic as priority theme at CSP8 and subsequent trainings and publications. Last year, WILF submitted a point-by-point in-depth response to the survey results published in the Vigeti CSP7 preparatory documents. And our full analysis of state responses from last year is annexed to this oral statement and available on the Reaching Critical Will website. In light of some states' problematic interpretations of international law within their export control systems shared up until this point, WILF cautions against viewing this document as a voluntary guide, or as expressed in a letter from the chair of the working group, and as I quote, possible options for approaching the interpretation of these concepts, particularly for these states parties that are still developing their export control systems and processes. Rather, we suggest using it as a survey of current state practice and as an entry point to identify weaknesses, but also recommend ways to improve and strengthen the application of international law. WILF sees a major issue with the fact that there is no check and balances of state parties' submissions that would assess and verify if current state practice indeed seeks to achieve the highest possible international common standards. That is, if states parties' shared practice is actually compliant with ATT standards. WILF is concerned about the possibility that the contents of this guide be cherry-picked by states still developing their export control systems. And there is a risk that this exercise could mislead states parties with regards to the appropriate ATT obligations. To ensure that states parties have access to understandings and interpretation of applicable international law to the highest standard, WILF encourages the chair to include the wealth of research by stakeholders other than states parties, including the ICRC and civil society organizations. And WILF and other civil society organizations stand ready in assisting states in clarifying their national and shared understanding and application of international law when implementing Article 6 and 7 of the ATT. And this is a shortened version of our statement. Our full statement will be available on the Reaching Critical Will website. I thank you.
Muchas gracias a la delegación de Wolf. Cedo el turno de palabra a la delegación del Estado de Palestina.
Palestine, the State of Palestine has the floor. Thank you, Wilf.
The State of Palestine would like to extend its deep gratitude to you as well as the chair of the CSP8 for leading our efforts in a transparent, comprehensive, and effective manner during the preparatory process for the coming Conference of States Parties. We also thank the Secretariat, the working group's chairs, and the subgroup facilitators for all their efforts in ensuring the success of this constructive dialogue. The State of Palestine is neither a manufacturer nor importer of conventional weapons, and in spite of the difficulties that our people are subjected to as a result of Israel's illegal occupation of our territory, we are keen in implementing all our duties and upholding all our responsibilities under the ATT, including reporting and financial obligations. This unwavering commitment is born of our deep conviction that a rules-based international order led by multilateralism is necessary for ensuring freedom, justice, and peace for all. In this regard, the State of Palestine, along with 20 other states parties, participated actively in the methodology exercise for the exchange of national practices and interpretation of some key concepts in Articles 6 and 7. We look forward to taking part in other similar exercises aimed at promoting the exchange of national practices. In this context, the State of Palestine reiterates that the general rule on the interpretation of treaties, as codified in Article 31 of the Vienna Convention on the Law of Treaties, provides that a treaty has to be interpreted in a good faith, in line with the ordinary meaning of its terms, in their context, and in light of its object and purpose. The purpose of the Arms Trade Treaty, as stated in Article 1, is contributing to international and regional peace, security, and stability, reducing human suffering, promoting cooperation, transparency, and responsible action by states parties in international trade in conventional arms, thereby building confidence among states parties. The obligation to respect and ensure respect of international humanitarian law under Article 1, common to the 1949 Geneva Conventions, is a key principle of the treaty. Articles 6 and 7 are at the core of the ATT and fundamental to accomplishing the ATT's humanitarian dimension. The standards they set are firm standards on the transfer of conventional arms, their ammunition and parts and components. The humanitarian perspective of the treaty and the right interpretation of its articles can put an end to serious violations of international human rights law and international humanitarian law. It can also enhance the treaty's universalization. Legal interpretation: we call upon states parties to harmonize their national laws in accordance with international law. This guide for interpreting the treaty, not for amending its articles. Due to the fact that we won't have enough time during this meeting to make specific comments on this guideline, State of Palestine will submit its detailed comments on the draft in a written format in the coming week. Thank you, Mr. President.
Muchas gracias.
Thank you very much to the State of Palestine. Switzerland has the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Facilitator. Switzerland appreciates the continued work on this voluntary guide. It is very useful to exchange information on the understanding of the specific provisions and concepts in the ATT. In our view, the collected information in Chapter 1 of the voluntary guide is very comprehensive, and Switzerland's past inputs are well reflected. We have a few minor suggestions for complementing elements that we would like to ask you to include into the document, if agreeable to everyone. We will provide them in writing to you, Mr. Facilitator, but I would like to highlight 4 of them verbally right away. In general, it seems relevant to us to emphasize somewhere in the guide that other instruments that are not explicitly mentioned might be of relevance for states and for the future work of the working group as well. We will make a suggestion in our written contribution. In paragraph 13, about the implementation of Article 7.1b.1, we would like to be a bit more specific with regard to an input that was originally provided by Switzerland. We would like to clarify that a serious violation of international humanitarian law goes beyond war crimes and applies to acts that are not criminalized as well. The additional language that we propose for paragraph 13 reads as follows, quote, "Serious violations of international humanitarian law do not require a specific element of intent," unquote. For paragraph 16, we simply ask you to include the Covenant on Civil and Political Rights of 1966 as well. Fourth, for paragraph 31, we suggest to be more specific in clarifying that according to Article 7.3, the overriding risk needs to prevail after having considered available mitigation measures in order for a denial to be mandatory. The fourth bullet in paragraph 31 currently reads as follows, quote, "A negative consequence set out in Article 7.1 is very likely or more likely than not to occur," unquote. And we suggest to add the following language, quote, "even after the expected effect of any mitigating measures have been considered," unquote. So the whole bullet 4 of paragraph 31 would read as follows, quote, "A negative consequence set out in Article 7.1 is very likely or more likely than not to occur, even after the expected effect of any mitigating measures have been considered," unquote. Finally, we agree with previous speakers that many concepts that are mentioned in the Arms Trade Treaty are already well established and have established definitions, and that this should be reflected accordingly in the document. As stated, we will provide these inputs as well as a few minor other proposals in writing to the Secretariat right after this meeting. Switzerland very much welcomes the further development of the voluntary guide and calls upon all states who have not yet done so to provide their interpretations and concepts to the facilitator for the completion of this document. Thank you very much, Mr. Facilitator.
Muchas gracias. A la delegación de Suiza tiene la palabra la delegación de la Unión Europea.
The EU has a...
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I have the honor to speak on behalf of the European Union and its member states, the candidate countries, Turkey, the Republic of North Macedonia, Montenegro, Serbia, and Albania, and the EFTA countries, Iceland and Norway, members of the European Economic Area, as well as Georgia, aligned themselves with the statement, now on Article 6 and 7. The EU underlines the essential contribution that the responsible arms trade policy makes to the maintenance of the European peace and security and respect for human rights and international humanitarian law. The prohibitions and assessment as contained in Articles 6 and 7 of the ATT mirror the 8 criteria of the 2008 944 CSP8 common position, against which application for the export and conventional arms are assessed by the European member states. In order to further promote convergence among the EU member states' arms export policies, the EU will soon launch an internal database accessible to all licensing officers from the EU member states. This database contains country pages on all potential export destinations for European military equipment and technology. Licensing officers will find relevant information in these country pages that, along with the relevant and sometimes confidential national resources, will facilitate their assessment of license application. The ultimate goal remains ensuring export licenses are only granted following the thorough risk assessment, including against the criteria regarding international humanitarian law, international human rights law, and international and regional stability. Mr. Chairman, among other cases, the EU member states deny licenses wherever they access that there is a clear risk that the military technology and equipment to be exported might be used for the internal repression, contribute to regional instability, or to commit or facilitate serious violation of human rights or international humanitarian law. The ATT is the first arms regulation treaty to recognize the link between conventional arms transfer and gender-based violence, mandating the gender-based violence to be considered in the course of export risk assessments. Its effective implementation can contribute to eliminating violence against women and girls, as set out in the Sustainable Development Goal Target 0.52. And Mr. Chairman, if you allow me, I touch upon briefly Article 11 in order to save the time for tomorrow. So on Article 11, the EU warmly welcomes establishment of the Diversion Information Exchange Forum, a platform to deal with the concrete cases of diversion, which represents an important deliverable of the 7th Conference of the State Parties. We look forward to the first formal session of the DIEF once broad in-person participation of states parties and signatories is possible. We hope that this is concrete addition to the ATT toolbox will assist state parties in addressing diversion challenges. Exchange of confidential information amongst states parties should help to prevent, whenever possible, export ending up in the wrong hands. We express full confidence in the chair of the DIEF to maintain the desirable level of confidentiality, while at the same time sharing relevant information with the key stakeholders, taking into account the invaluable expertise of civil society. I thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Muchas gracias a la delegación de la Unión Europea.
Thank you, EU. I now give the floor to MAT, the MAT delegation, MATT. You have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for giving us the floor to submit our questions under Articles 6 and 7. MAT has direct communications and direct observations. As you have said, there are 20 countries that have submitted their observations and other non-governmental organizations on Article 6 and 7. This raises concern regarding the paucity of participation. We should like to work together in order to support the causes and the objectives of the ATT. We should like to encourage the participation in the meetings of the ATT in order to encourage the participation of civil society. As for supporting the role of civil society to buttress cooperation and collaboration in order to realize the objectives of the conference. There are a number of states that continue to suffer from inner strife, from conflict, from armed conflict, and one of the examples was only Afghanistan and what's happening in Afghanistan. We should like to know what are the commitments that have requested from them in order to fulfill their commitment regarding the control of arms. Regarding the gross violations of human rights measures in IHL, we should like to say that MAT would like to carry a survey on all the violations that emanate from armed conflicts, particularly in our region, and MAT proposes that there would be more ample clarifications in the specifications, and this would help the states in the implementations and the follow-up of the violations and the implementation of the objectives of the ATT, as well as the implementations of the objectives of 6 and 7, and combating the violations of the measures of human rights under IHL. Thank you.
Muchas gracias.
Thank you. I now give the floor to the delegation of the Republic of Korea.
Thank you for giving me the floor, Ambassador. This is the first time for me to take the floor at this meeting. I would like to extend my sincere gratitude to Ambassador Gebel, the CSP8 President, Ambassador Lim, the WGTI Chair, Ambassador Sanchez, the facilitator of the working group of Articles 6 and 7, and the Secretariat for their devotion to organize this meeting. The Republic of Korea welcomes the paper on draft elements for Chapter 1 Key Concepts of the Voluntary Guide to implementing Articles 6 and 7 of the ATT, which the facilitator presented on the basis of the result of the methodology template exercise during CSP6 and CSP7. We appreciated the facilitator's continuous efforts to incorporate the exercise into the draft paper. We assess that draft faithfully reflects the opinions of state parties, which submitted written comments on the methodology template exercise and the opinions expressed in the previous working group meetings. In particular, the draft elaborated references to legal instruments and clarified the already established concepts in international laws by adding in its annex the provisions of relevant international laws, which include the definitions of some key concepts. We believe that this voluntary guide will be another helpful reference for interested state parties when conducting risk assessment prior to authorizing expert and interpreting Articles 6 and 7. The Republic of Korea supports this exercise and possible guidelines in that the state parties in the process of developing their expert control systems can voluntarily refer to and use this exercise for their capacity building to better implement the ATT. I thank you.
Muchas gracias a la delegación de Corea.
Thank you, Korea. I now give the floor to the delegation of the People Federation for National Peace and Development.
Parece haber algún problema de...
It seems like we're experiencing technical problems. I now give the floor to France. France, you have the floor.
Hello to all. Thank you for giving me the floor. I would like to thank you, Mr. Facilitator, and I also would like to thank Ambassador Goebel from Germany and the Secretariat for the excellent organization of this meeting. Mr. Facilitator, thank you for the presentation that you made a few moments ago regarding your proposals, following the work that was carried out in the context of the exchange of views and information relating to national practices as regards to the implementation of the key concepts that we find under Article 6 and 7 of the treaty. As you know, we have contributed to this work, recalling our national practices in this area that are based on an assessment on a case-by-case basis. This is the result of an interministerial evaluation. We take into account various sources of information. We also take into consideration the context and the circumstances of a given export, the final destination, as well as the final use and the final user, and also the nature and type, as well as quantity of material and equipment concerned. We would like to recall that we believe that this guide, its objective is to give us the landscape of current practices, identify possible solutions to implement these concepts without seeking to interpret a single concept. And this is something that is very important. France would also like to recall that various tools have been developed to help the states in the national implementation of the ATT and Article 6 and 7 in particular. And the guide, here's a guide of the European Union, which you have actually mentioned in your report, and thank you for this. This document was recently re-examined to take into account some of the provisions of the treaty to which all of the members of the European Union are party. Mr. Facilitator, we'd like to thank you for your efforts, and you can rest assured that France remains willing to contribute actively to the work of this working group that aims to exchange information between states parties and the way in which they implement at the national level Articles 6 and 7 of the treaty. Thank you.
Thank you, France. I now give the floor to Control Arms.
Thank you, Mr. Facilitator, and thank you to Ambassador Goebel and the ATT Secretariat for all of their efforts to put this meeting together today and this week. In Ethiopia, more than 300 civilians have been killed by drone and airstrikes since September 2021, including more than 100 since the start of this year. Thousands are estimated to have died in the conflict in Tigray to date, and more than 4 million others in Tigray and neighboring regions face humanitarian crisis. In July 2021, the Human Rights Council expressed grave concern at the reports of serious human rights violations and abuses and violations of international humanitarian law and international refugee law allegedly committed by all parties in the Tigray region since the start of the conflict on 4 November 2020. Despite these findings, media reports claim that Turkey, a signatory to the ATT, sold armed drones to Ethiopia as recently as October 2021, well after atrocities had been documented. Indeed, a recent investigation supported by Control Arms member PACs linked weapons remnants from a strike on the 7th of January, which killed almost 60 civilians, to Turkish-made drones and munitions. Reports also claim evidence of Chinese and Iranian-built drones at air bases in Ethiopia as of August of 2021. With weapons still fueling violations in Tigray and in too many other conflicts around the world, where violations of international human rights and humanitarian law have been documented, there is an ever-present and urgent need for ATT states parties to effectively implement Articles 6 and 7 of the treaty. Developing, establishing, and refining national policies and processes that support effective implementation of Articles 6 and 7 is critical to achieving the ATT's object and purpose to reduce human suffering. However, it must be stressed that even the best arms transfer control systems in the world will be of little use if states parties do not have the political will and conviction to ensure that Articles 6 and 7, alongside the treaty's other operative provisions, are implemented faithfully in the spirit and to the letter. Thus far, too many states parties are failing to meet their ATT obligations in a consistent manner. Control Arms stands ready to work alongside all ATT stakeholders to change this. Mr. Facilitator, the work done in this sub-working group on Articles 6 and 7 by states parties is crucial and has the power to strengthen ATT implementation at the national level and ultimately to save lives. With this in mind, Control Arms offers the following comments on the sub-working group's progress thus far. Control Arms sees the value in collecting and logging state party viewpoints on how they consider, interpret, and apply these key concepts that underpin Articles 6 and 7. We believe that this exercise encourages much needed information sharing among ATT stakeholders and exemplifies one of the key purposes of the ATT, and that is to promote transparency. However, control arms also remains uncertain about the sub-working group's methodology for unpacking the identified key concepts. As a sub-working group moves ahead with its draft voluntary guide, control arms urges it to make clear in the document the difference between a collection of self-reported national interpretations that may or may not be compliant with the ATT commitments and that of well-established international legal standards. As Wilf mentioned earlier in its statement today, a clear reference is needed at the outset of this document, identifying this exercise as a survey and not, as referenced earlier, best practices. This distinction is critical so that states parties and potential states parties are not misled, but understand that these national submissions have not been deemed best practices. Instead, they are a starting point to assess what best practices might be going forward. As referenced earlier by Belgium, Control Arms also notes, as it did during the CSP7 cycle, that the key concepts chapter includes input from just 20 of the 110 states parties of the ATT. Unfortunately, this small percentage of respondents does not convey the breadth and diversity of ATT states parties. To create more value, Control Arms suggests that the sub-working group provides states parties with a continuing opportunity to contribute to the key concepts section of the voluntary guide, as it is drafted over the next 4 working group meetings spanning the next 2 years. By designating the survey of key concept interpretations as a work in progress document, new states parties can contribute as they accede to and implement the treaty, and existing states parties can contribute, and existing states parties can provide initial or supplemental information as they develop or refine their risk assessment practices to strengthen ATT compliance. To this end, Control Arms and its coalition members pledge its support to the facilitator in encouraging states parties to contribute their perspectives into this document on an ongoing basis. Continuous updating will further ensure the utility of this survey into the future. Finally, as Control Arms suggested in its statement to CSP7 last August, a key resource for inclusion in later chapters of the proposed voluntary guide would be real-world examples of how states parties apply their arms transfer prohibition and risk assessment processes from start to finish. Cooperation and information sharing within this sub-working group can shed light and provide more clarity on how states parties take decisions to authorize and deny export licenses. This will, in turn, improve transparency in the arms trade and enhance the potential for consistent and rigorous application of Articles 6 and 7 with the overall aim of reducing human suffering. Thank you, Mr. Facilitator.
Muchas gracias. A Control Arms tiene la palabra la delegación de Nueva Zelanda.
Thank you very much, Control Arms New Zealand. You have the floor.
Thank you, Ambassador Sanchez, for your update and the excellent work that you have led as facilitator for treaty implementation. Can I also commend Ambassador Goebel and the ATT Secretariat for the excellent preparatory work that has gone into hosting our meeting today. You have my delegation's full support. New Zealand appreciates the opportunity to consider draft elements of Chapter 1 of the Voluntary Guide to implementing Articles 6 and 7 of the Arms Trade Treaty, and thanks you and all of our colleagues that have contributed to this draft. It is very useful to see our views collected and documented in one place. We consider it will serve as a useful tool both for the conduct of export assessments and for training and capacity building purposes. New Zealand is home to a small export assessment team. We are currently implementing a wide range of recommendations made during an independent review of our export controls regime last year. As part of this process, we see value in the voluntary guide's efforts to share states' views and concrete experience in their interpretation of key terms in Articles 6 and 7 of the ATT. Beyond the useful collation of legal sources, we have paid close attention to how others are approaching the interpretation of phrases such as overriding risk and how that relates to mitigating measures, as well as these sorts of considerations that affect how states determine the appropriate threshold for the phrase knowledge at the time of the authorization. We are particularly interested in the concept of risk and how parties to the ATT are responding to it. It is clear that risk appetites vary between states, and that we can and do take different decisions about what is an acceptable level of risk when authorising a transfer. It is also clear that the concept of legal risk is a very different form of risk compared with political, reputational, or moral risk, and that those conducting export assessments are being asked to deal with several such risks simultaneously. Against that backdrop, we will be interested in further conversations about how states are approaching these various risk assessments. New Zealand is interested in discussing further how states approach situations that fall short of the relatively high thresholds envisaged in Articles 6 and 7. Bearing in mind that the treaty's objectives to establish the highest possible common international standards for regulating or improving the regulation of the international trade in conventional arms. We are interested in the extent to which states are interpreting the treaty in a precautionary manner. This may be reflected in how assessors calculate the level of risk they are comfortable with, or the extent and quality of the information they demand from exporters and end users in order to have confidence in the knowledge they have at the time of authorising an export. These are complex and interconnected considerations, and New Zealand would see value in further discussions. We look forward to engaging further in the consideration of the voluntary guide, and thank you once again, Ambassador, for your work in leading this process. Thank you.
Thank you, New Zealand. I now give the floor to the delegation of ACER, ACER. ACER, you have the floor.
Merci, Monsieur l'Ambassadeur. Nous tenons à
Thank you, Mr. Ambassador. We would like to pay tribute to you for the work that has been undertaken on the interpretation of Articles 6 and 7 of the ATT. We find that this work is really very interesting. We would also like to thank the Secretariat for its extensive work, for having organized the meeting here in Geneva, for making it possible for us to have exchanges of views on these very important topics to ensure an effective implementation of the treaty. We also would like to support Switzerland and the position that it expressed a little earlier. We would like to add that it appears important to specify more clearly the difference between Articles 6 and 7 of the ATT. And for us, there's no risk assessment under Article 6 because at no stage in the text of Article 6 do we see any mention of risk assessment. We talk about a given situation where states have a certain level of knowledge at the time the authorization to export is given. And we do realize that this is a very important issue to deal with. The French government continues to authorize arm exports towards coalition countries that are intervening in the conflict in Yemen, including Saudi Arabia and United Arab Emirates. And if I look at Article 6.3, it is stated very clearly that any authorization regarding the transfer of the conventional arms under Article 2 talks about the knowledge at the time of the export that could be used to commit serious human rights violations against civilians or civilian goods. And there, in our opinion, it is necessary to explain more clearly why in the Yemeni conflict there is no violation of the 1949 Geneva Conventions. If there are no crimes against humanity or war crimes that are committed or attacks against civilians. So there is a responsibility on the parts of the states, very clear, and a necessity to specify these issues to make it possible for us all to respect the spirit of the treaty, which is to preserve lives, human life. And if we look at the preamble of the treaty, we see very clearly that the respect for human rights, peace, and security are all intrinsically linked to one another. And this is something that we should recall. We should always remember the spirit of this treaty. As the representative of Palestine said a few moments ago, it's very important to respect the Vienna Treaty in particular, and to respect the various international treaties in good faith.
Yes.
Thank you very much for your intervention. I now give the floor to Japan. You have the floor, Japan.
Mr. President, at the outset, let me express our sincere appreciation for Ambassador Goodell, your efforts to commence the preparatory process of the CSP8 cycle despite the unprecedented circumstances due to the COVID-19 pandemic. Japan stands ready to work with all delegations, and I assure you of my delegation's full support and cooperation throughout the CSP8 cycle. Mr. Facilitator, Japan also appreciates Ambassador Sanchez Duran for your dedication to the work of this sub-working group. Japan recognizes the vital importance of the working group on effective treaty implementations as a forum for discussion to promote and enhance the implementation of the ATT. Japan would like to thank the facilitator for preparing the draft elements for the voluntary guide to assist the state parties in implementing Articles 6 and 7 of the treaty. Japan welcomes the concept of the proposed draft, which consists of the compilation of the views and input from state parties as a reference and doesn't include any definitions of each term. Japan understands the proposed draft contains general and selective input from state parties. In particular, the list of international instruments and concepts illustrated in paragraph 16, 17, and 18 in the draft remains indicative in nature. It should be also noted that not all the state parties have ratified these conventions. While these indicative lists would be useful as a reference for the export control authorities of each state that are in the process of establishing their own system to fulfill their ATT commitments, it is also possible that the indicative list in the voluntary guide could be interpreted as comprehensive. In order to avoid any unnecessary misunderstanding by the authorities that conduct export assessments, Japan would like to suggest to add an explanation in the paragraph 16, 17, and 18 that these lists are indicative in nature, that they are a compilation of the input from the various state parties, and are to be useful as a reference to assist in implementing Articles 6 and 7. We also believe that it could be advisable to include an additional note that mentions that the list of the international instruments in the paragraph 16, 17, and 18 do not represent a common understanding of all the state parties. Japan would like to highly appreciate if the facilitator could consider ways to add such explanations to improve it further. Lastly, Japan would like to thank you again for your all efforts. We hope that proposed voluntary guide will be built up to enhance the implementation of the ATT, and Japan looks forward to contributing to its development. Thank you, Mr. Facilitator.
Muchas gracias.
Thank you, Japan. Thank you very much. Before I give the floor to the next delegation, I would like to request, we have an issue with time. I worked on the multi-annual draft project for a session that was supposed to be 3 hours and which has been now reduced to 90 minutes, and which have now been even dwindled even more because of the lengthy statements. We still we only have half a session left, but we have many items. I will now give the floor to China, Mexico, Ghana, and will give the delegation to the PFN. But I will close with Ghana because unfortunately, otherwise we will run out of time. I therefore ask everybody to be brief. I now give the floor to the delegation of China.
Thank you, Mr. Facilitator. This is the first time we take the floor. I would like to take this opportunity to thank the Ambassador Gobel and the Secretariat for the arrangements for this meeting. I would also like to commend them. China has attached great importance to the implementation of Articles 6 and 7. China has always adopted a prudent and responsible attitude toward arms trade. Its level of administration of military products has exceeded the treaty's requirements. The government has established a comprehensive set of laws and regulations on the military products export control. They must respect three principles, which are conducive to the legitimate self-defense capability of the recipient country, not undermine peace, security, and stability of the region concerned, the world, non-interference in the internal affairs of recipient countries. We would like to stress that we have never exported weapons to non-state actors. We call on all countries to implement their obligations. We support all state parties to strengthen their compliance capacity and share their own practices in implementing relevant treaty articles. We also welcome the working group to establish the voluntary guidance for the Articles 6 and 7. In the meantime, with regard to the discussion of the obligations of the treaty, we should avoid new or reinterpretation of the key legal concepts so that we will not exceed the scope and obligations already included in the treaty so that we can sustain the effectiveness and authority of the treaty. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Mexico has the floor. Thank you very much, Facilitator, for giving me the floor. I'd like to take a few minutes to thank the Secretariat for organizing this meeting in a hybrid mode, which facilitates the participation of everyone. We thank you and your team for compiling this first draft of the voluntary guide on the draft elements of key concepts for Articles 6 and 7. My delegation, more specifically, would like to state that grave or serious violations against human rights and international humanitarian law is fundamental in the application of these articles, but we also need to give priority to risks associated to organized crime in the transfer of weapons or to the fact that the exporting industry may alleviate some of their containment measures. We need a voluntary guide that caters for all the elements of Article 7, and we believe that we should advance in this direction. Thank you. Thank you very much, Mexico. Germany has the floor.
Thank you. First of all, I would like to thank the working group for its very important and valuable contribution in establishing the voluntary guide. This has to be mentioned. And I would like to thank, of course, the Secretariat for organizing the meeting, which runs quite smoothly. I would like to take the opportunity to make some general remarks. On the one hand, Germany takes gender-based violence via international humanitarian and human rights law very seriously when deciding on export applications of weapons and similar goods. On the other hand, Germany is of the opinion that there is a need to build more expertise internationally on how to approach arms control in a gender-sensitive way. The uneven playing field between those that need to prove the risk of arms contributing to gender-based violence and those benefiting from arms exports need to be taken into account in discussions of this topic. Fortunately, the civil society in Germany, as well as internationally, is really active in promoting the subject women, peace and security as such, as well as in looking for internationally relevant means of ending that kind of violence. Germany is proud of supporting relevant projects of the civil society on the subject women, peace and security, and would like to thank organizations such as the Stimson Center for its contributions in that regard. Germany looks forward to further discussions among state parties as well as with the civil society on the very important topic, women, peace and security. Thank you, Mr. Facilitator.
Vielen Dank, Deutschland. Pasamos la palabra al...
Thank you very much, Germany. Ghana, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Mr. Facilitator, for giving me the floor. On behalf of my delegation, we welcome the work done by you and the Secretariat to unpack the provisions of Article 6 and 7 of the ATT. We support the approach used by you to seek views from states and based on their national practices on how they actually implement Articles 6 and 7. We also welcome the proposed voluntary guide that you have presented to us. And we, from the developing side of the world, see these voluntary guides as key in providing the necessary capacity to us to enable us to implement ATT and its provisions effectively. We see the current guide in its form, subject to further inputs and refinement from states, a key tool to assist states implement the provisions of Article 6 and 7 effectively. We, however, wish to, we are very flexible on this, but we see the use of weapons and conventional arms interchangeably a bit not in the right way. We would like to see a more consistent use of the words, either conventional arms or the use of weapons. We also stand ready to assist the facilitator in whatever form to finalize the document and see its use. Thank you very much, Mr. Facilitator.
Muchas gracias, Ghana.
Thank you very much, Ghana. People Federation of National Peace and Development. We will try and see if they are now connected online. It seems not. So I'd like to now take up some of the elements you have shared with us. First of all, I'd like to thank each and everyone for their interventions. I have the impression that more than half of those that have taken the floor coincides with the state parties that actually submitted their contributions in writing. And this leads me to the following reflection. This is a collective exercise of all parties that are a part of the ATT. Some of you have asked me to extend the period of submissions, something which we did in several occasions during COVID, and the end result was the same. Therefore, the version of this document, of the report that was submitted in April, I think we can see it as a final version. This doesn't mean that we cannot improve Chapter 1. Of course we can. This is a collective effort. The states of Palestine and Switzerland have submitted specific suggestions, and they have already let us know that they will be sending their submissions in writing. This is an opportunity available to all of you, so that if you wish, you can send us your submissions in writing to further develop this voluntary guide. I'm addressing this call as well to civil society. We all need to participate actively to have a complete voluntary guide. Some states have indicated that they are concerned by the fact that we are working with concepts that are rooted in international law, in norms, or in custom. The idea is to include all these boxes that you find in chapter 1, box number 1 and box number 2, to include in those boxes the international texts we are referring to in the guide. We want to make this guide as user-friendly as possible, and without a doubt, certain concepts which are rooted in international law will not be reinterpreted in this exercise. We are speaking about a voluntary guide to train in the implementation of the treaty. It's a voluntary guide for the training of implementation. This means it's not a compulsory guide, and all its content is indicative. It will include references that we want to be helpful for those in charge of implementing the articles of the treaty. We want to improve, in other words, the capacities of countries. But these countries, at a later stage, will decide in a sovereign manner, how they will implement the treaty. What we want is to capacitate those people to implement efficiently or effectively the treaty. We don't want this guide to serve them in the interpretation of the guide, but rather to serve them in the implementation, effective implementation of the guide. National authorities are responsible for the implementation of the treaty. What is the civil subsidiary responsibility of the different authorities? That's up to every state. But here in this treaty, we refer to the responsibility of states, and states are ultimately responsible, not the people that implement the articles of the treaty. That's a civil subsidiary responsibility. I think we cannot finish our work on this first chapter yet. My idea was to address this matter in 1 hour, but given that we have extended that time and we only have 15 minutes left, I'd like to address the questions we've included for the implementation of Article 6. That is topic 6, scope of Article 5. A scope of Article 6, sorry. I know we will not be able to exhaust all the questions in the remaining 15 minutes, but I gather that in our next session, in the month of April, we will only have this item left, scope of Article 6. Therefore, I'd like to hear your preliminary remarks with respect to these 3 questions, which we have projected on the screen and which you have translated in your respective languages in the documents available. If you wish to provide us with more details in advance of the next session in April, you can send your ideas in writing. Let me give you the floor now.
Yo no llevo gafas.
Excuse me, but I'm not wearing glasses and I cannot see you. You have the floor in any case. Thank you very much, facilitator. This is Argentina. It is the first time we are taking the floor, therefore I'd like to congratulate you for being designated as facilitator of this working group. I'd also like to thank the presidency and the secretariat for organizing this meeting and wish them all the best. This treaty has been transposed into our legal order, and we have adjusted our national control system so that the procedure of assessment includes the procedures reflected in Article 6 and 7, namely in matters referring to human rights and gender. We assess munitions and firearms in this vein. With regards to the questions referring to Article 6.1, obligations under measures adopted by the United Nations Security Council, in virtue of Chapter 7, in our procedure, we assess embargoes and the list of the Committee for Terrorist Sanctions. We also assess whether the beneficiary country has been included in the list of sanctioned countries of the UN Security Council. Regardless of the fact that we have a national control system, it's still hard or challenging for us to determine when the export of conventional arms could potentially be used to commit or facilitate a serious breach of international humanitarian law or human rights, or to commit or facilitate gender-based violence or other serious breaches against children and women. In this sense, my delegation deems that we need to reinforce this article to better assess the risks associated to beneficiary countries. Thank you. Thank you very much, Argentina. Canada has the floor.
Merci, Monsieur le Facilitateur.
Thank you very much, Mr. Moderator. We'd like to thank you first for your excellent work as a moderator of this group. We'd also like to congratulate Germany for its election to the chairmanship of the 8th conference. And here we have to deal with a certain number of the agenda and the efforts deployed by Canada on arms trade. Mr. Moderator, concerning Article 5 on voluntary conditions, we consider Article 6 and 7 being the main provisions of the treaty, and it's on this basis that we are happy to take part in the process of the fundamental concepts of Article 6 and 7 by submitting our own interpretation. Our participation is based on the voluntary document, means that the states have the responsibility of implementing their own systems. We felt it useful that state parties should share information for the implementation of the treaty. Canada is happy to see the first outline of this chapter. We'd like to thank the moderator and the Secretariat for the work carried out, as well as all state parties and other entities that have taken part in this exercise. Concerning Theme 6 on the field of application of Article 6, as Article 6 is fundamental to the treaty, we would like to point out that Canada was going to submit its vision on the field of application of Article 6. I'd now like to switch to English, if I may.
On September 1st, 2019, legislative amendments were made to the Export and Import Permits Act, which forms the basis of Canada's national control system. These changes included embedding the ATT assessment criteria of Article 7.1 directly in the Export and Import Permits Act. In recognition of the importance of addressing gender-based violence and violence against women and children, as set out in Article 7.4, Canada made the conscious decision to give this criterion the same weight and importance as those of Article 7.1. In addition, Canada embedded the concept of overriding risk known in our legislation as substantial risk. As a result, if there is a substantial risk of any of the negative consequences listed in Article 7.1 and Article 7.4, the Minister of Foreign Affairs, who is responsible for the issuance of export and brokering permits, is required to deny the permit application. We viewed ATT accession as an opportunity to further enhance the rigor of our trade controls, and therefore chose to apply the ATT criteria and the substantial risk test, not only to propose exports and brokering of ATT items, but also to all military and dual-use items. As mentioned during the last Conference of States Parties and Canada's report on exports of military goods for 2020 that we tabled in our Parliament, we reported that Canada denied 5 permit applications that year because there was a substantial risk that the proposed export would have resulted in one or more of the negative consequences set out in the ATT assessment criteria. More specifically, these denials were made on the grounds of a substantial risk of serious violations of international humanitarian law, serious violations of international human rights law, and serious acts of gender-based violence. Mr. Facilitator, with this information, we would like to assure you and the presidency of our full support throughout this meeting and in your efforts leading up to the 8th Conference of the States Parties. Thank you.
Muchas gracias, Canadá.
Thank you very much, Canada, for your intervention. I see that there are no other requests to take the floor. I hope I didn't cut you off before when I said we didn't have enough time, but I see that the state of Palestine has decided to take the floor.
Thank you, Mr. President. Just one general remark. Before answering and discussing the scope of Article 6, I would like to remind the importance of taking into consideration the jus cogens and erga omnes rules of international law, the principle of international law that is based on values taken to be fundamental to the international community and that cannot be set aside. It must be taken into consideration when we discuss the following questions, and State of Palestine will be submitting a written explanation answering those questions to be discussed in April meeting. Thank you.
Muchas gracias, Estado de Palestina. Doy la palabra a la delegación.
Thank you very much, State of Palestine. Switzerland has the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Facilitator. In the interest of time, please allow me to just make a reference to the first question regarding transfer of Article 6. I would just like to provide to everybody our understanding that we consider 2 factors relevant. One is the physical transfer and the other is the transfer of control. So if a state is exporting military goods, conventional arms, physically across border and hands over the control of these items as well, this would be relevant in terms of the transfer within the ATT. So this is irrespective of whether it is a sale, a loan, a lease, or a gift. If it is a transfer with an associated handover of control, it would be covered by the treaty in our opinion. Just let me make one example. If country A sends conventional weapons for peacekeeping missions to country B and also hands over the control of these weapons to the other country, this would be a transfer that falls under the Arms Trade Treaty. I am happy to provide our other answers to the posed questions in writing as well to you. Thank you very much.
Muchas gracias a la delegación de Suiza.
Thank you very much, Switzerland. If there are no further requests, I would like to quickly address some other matters before handing over the floor to the other facilitator of the other working group. But before that, I see Ghana would like to take the floor.
Catching you off guard. This is just a very brief one. Also to inform you that in ECOWAS, we have an regional approach in addressing a transfer of small arms and light weapons within the ECOWAS region. Specifically, we employ the ECOWAS exemption regime. So under the ECOWAS Convention on Small Arms and Light Weapons, The transfer of small arms and light weapons within the ECOWAS region is actually prohibited. And for a state to be able to procure weapons, it needs what we call the exemption. That is all the 15 member states doesn't raise any objection against the transfer. We will provide, as others have also indicated, we will provide you some further details on this, which we hope will guide your work in the coming April meeting. I thank you, Mr. Press Facilitator. Thank you.
Muchas gracias.
Thank you very much, Ghana. We now are under the understanding that our April session will be focusing on Article 6, answering the 3 questions that we had planned for today, as well as the questions that were in the April meeting's annual plan process. We need to focus the content, as Palestine has said. We need to be choosing what are the exact references we need to use when we're talking about transfers. These are well-regulated concepts, and we must be able to give the indication so that that voluntary guide be as complete as possible. And in order to do so, and as many delegations have already said, I would like to invite you to send your written statements and comments before the meeting, so that this process be fed by everybody's contributions. It is now 2:30 when we are meant to finish with the work of our working group. We now give the floor to the subgroup on Article 9 so that they have time as well for their task. Thank you very much for your participation, for your collaboration, and I am at your entire disposal for this work towards the April meeting. Thank you.
Well, good afternoon, everyone. All the delegates, whether in the room or online. For the continuation of our discussion on Article 9 of the ATT on transit and transshipment. Just by way of introduction, you may recall that the last cycle, the CSP7 cycle, worked within the context of the sub-working group's multi-year work plan and looked at 2 topics. The first topic being trying to unpack the concept of transit and the concept of transshipment. Topic 2 also looked at 2 concepts. The first was under its jurisdiction, and the other topic, or the other item, was what is meant by the term through its territory in accordance with international law from a law of the sea perspective. As I've done previously, I wish to emphasize that our focus is to see if we can reach some common understandings on these terms. I raised the possibility of exploring the development of a compendium of national practice and or a voluntary guide in the context of supporting the implementation of Article 9. I stated that the latter would be the preferred option, that being a voluntary guide. We'll continue today by having an in-depth look at the measures at national level to regulate transit and transshipment of arms by land and sea. This process will be greatly facilitated by the electronic submission of your inputs to the ATT Secretariat. By way of kicking off our discussion today, we have an expert presenter, Dr. Julia Hernig, who is an assistant professor at Erasmus School of Law at the Erasmus University in Rotterdam, the Netherlands. She's a fully qualified lawyer in Germany, studied in Frankfurt and Rotterdam, and is specialized in transport and maritime law. Her PhD project was about the multimodal transport in an air-road combination. She was graduated by the University of Lucerne in Switzerland. I believe she's online. You have the floor, Professor.
Thank you very much for the introduction. I hope everyone can hear me. I'd like to share the screen. And yes. So thank you very much for the invitation, and thank you very much for the chance to present this very interesting topic. I'd like to speak about the transport and transit of arms by road and air. And therefore, I have the following agenda. First, I would like to speak about the relation between transport law and transit regulations. Later on, then the international transport law and how it works will be presented, because I think it's quite interesting and also necessary to talk about the function of the international transport conventions. And last but not least, of course, I would like to focus on transport of arms by road and transport of arms by air, closing with multimodal transport of arms, because I believe that there is a lot to discover as well, because there are major uncertainties still. When we talk about transport law and the transit regulations, we need to make a clear distinction. First of all, the transit regulation always talk about the if. So whether there is permission given to start an arms transport, whether it is allowed to have arms transport in general, and whether all involved countries of the transit or transshipment gave permission. When we talk about transit itself, so there is no broad international definition. So in principle, also in the basic understanding of Article 5 GATT, it can be understood as transport of goods across the territory of member states. In the present context, of course, the member states here refers to the ATT. When we talk about transshipment, this is rather also from a transport law perspective, an operational term. So it at least involves the unloading of the container from one transport means and deloading to another transport means. But there are a lot of other operations involved that may cause some risks and also some liabilities. So when we talk about transshipment, we usually talk about operations like unloading, processing it to the other transport means, weighing, inspecting, consolidating, intermediate warehousing, and even customs clearance, maybe. An additional point is that the transit regulation also cover a permission under certain conditions, meaning the requirements to safeguard the entire voyage, to cover the entire voyage with documentation and information to inform the relevant authorities, and to have certain requirements regarding the training of the employees, so all staff members involved in such transit, so that the safe transport can be ensured, and safe transport usually refers to measures that prevent robbery or thefts or any similar cases whereby military cargo leaves the cargo compartment in illegitimate manner. So this is what transit regulations are about. When we talk about transport law, we need to talk about the obligations and rights of parties to a transport contract. This means there are duties involved, like information about the characteristics of the cargo, like labeling, packing, storing, lashing, and also the duty of the carrier himself, the duty of care during the transport so that the cargo is or arrives unharmed. I would like to exemplify this with a very, very basic scheme. So the seller and the buyer are usually the parts or the parties to a contract of sale. I think this is clear to everyone. The seller or the buyer can be a state, it can also be a company. The fact is, it is usually a contract of sale or it is a contract of loan. So for the performance of the contract of sale, of course, the goods need to be delivered, and there the contract of carriage comes into play. Within the context of a contract of carriage, the seller or the buyer, depending on the contract of sale, I chose the seller here, is named the shipper. So the party that has a contract with the carrier, and the carrier is the party that carries the good or agrees to perform the transport to a designated consignee. So just to see how different the terminology here is. Then, according to transport law, the shipper I mentioned before has the duty to pack. He has also the duty to inform the carrier and to provide the carrier with necessary documentation. Why is this the shipper's task usually? The parties can derogate from it a bit. The reason is the shipper knows its goods best. And that is the whole reason, because the carrier does not know what is within the package and what the special needs of these type of cargo are. The carrier, on the other hand, has a duty of care for the cargo, a duty of care for other cargo on board as well, so that the cargo that is loaded and belongs to this shipper does not harm the other cargo on board or in the truck. And of course, the carrier has also a public duty regarding the traffic. So to have a safe transport means and to prevent any accidents in traffic. And here the transit regulations come into play because they indirectly influence the private obligations. They influence the obligation to pack. An arm transport cannot be done with a package that consists of paper package, for instance. There must be wooden boxes. It also must be labeled appropriately, the cargo, because otherwise the carrier simply doesn't know what type of cargo the carrier is carrying. And then this makes, of course, it quite hard for the carrier to comply with the duty to safeguard the transport. And in this way, the transit regulation constitutes documentation duties and information duties, so to inform all involved member states and the authorities of transit states. So this means, in general, transit regulations concern both the shippers and the carrier's duties. I talked about transport law a lot. So transport law is quite unique when it comes to the way how they work, how the transport conventions work. First of all, they are uniform law. This means they apply without national law to implement rules. This means they apply directly between the private parties. You must imagine it's like small code of civil codes that apply between the private parties and provide rules on particular issues of the contract of carriage by a certain transport mode. They are mandatory law. Mandatory law means no matter what the parties agreed upon, the transport law convention's rules apply. If the parties deviate from the transport law conventions, these clauses will be considered null and void, and the transport conventions will override it. And last but not least, the application scope focuses on two very important elements: the international transport. This means it doesn't matter where the company is located. It only means, so the company of the shipper is located or the company of the transport operator is located. It only matters whether the route, so the place of departure and the place of delivery, is located in two different countries, usually in member states. So this varies a bit between the transport conventions. They also only apply to contracts of carriage and not to freight forwarding contracts or logistic contracts. Very, very briefly, freight forwarding contracts are contracts whereby a transport operator not only agrees upon transporting the goods from A to B, but also taking care of all the organizational tasks: labeling, packaging, customs clearance, warehousing, everything related to this. So an entire logistic puzzle, basically. When we look at the transport by road, so we now focus only on this relationship. And of course, then the beneficiary will be the consignee. Then the international instrument we can rely upon is the Convention on the Contract for the International Carriage of Goods by Road, the so-called CMR. The CMR is considered to be an international instrument, but it has a regional impact. Why do I say this? This has to do with the limited number of ratifications. So it has only 58 member states. All European countries are members to the CMR. Some countries in North Africa, so for instance, Morocco, in the Middle East, also Afghanistan and Iran, and North Asia, for instance, Kazakhstan. There is no ratification by any North or Southern American country. So this is basically, this limits the scope of the CMR, of course. It applies only to international transports, whereby the place of departure or the place of delivery is located in a member state, but it must be an international transport. So there must be this crossing border moment. We also have regional instruments. So there is the Inter-American Convention on Contracts for the International Carriage of Goods by Road. We also have the ECOWAS, and we also have Inter-American Manual on Traffic Control Devices for Streets and Highways, and also Intergovernmental Agreement on the Asian Highway Network. These cannot be considered transport law in the real sense because they do not work like this uniform conventions. This only applies to the Inter-American Convention that is quite similar to the CMR, but has a limited scope. So there are not as many rules as provided under the CMR. If none of the conventions apply, then we only have national law. And national law in particular only applies in cases of freight forwarding contracts. So the very complex contract I mentioned, there is no international instrument. And this means we have no international law according to Article 9. Of course, national law also applies if we have only a domestic transport, so a transport within one country. When we talk about arms transport, of course, the first thing that comes to mind is dangerous goods. So we have rules on agreement concerning the international carriage of dangerous goods by road. And the general rule is that it is relevant for explosive goods, at least for our present scenario. Of course, it also relates to biological substances that may be hazardous. So in such a case, the shipper is obliged to provide special information, and special labeling is required, marking, stowing is required, and security measures have to be in place, as well as the training of the staff. But regarding Article 9, this is not really of relevance, given the scope of Article 9 ATT and the reference to Article 2 of ATT. Here, ammunition is regulated in Article 3, and this means that all the goods that are transported according to Article 2 ATT are not considered dangerous goods, except if they are loaded. So if these, especially small arms, are loaded and transported loaded, then the dangerous goods will apply. When it comes to transit regulations, so the if and if yes, under which conditions, then we can rely upon the Wassenaar Agreement, the 2001 Firearm Protocol of the United Nations, which is also implemented by the regulation of the European Union at a regional level. And we have also regionally the directive of the Directive 2009 of the European Union that refers to safety of transport, and especially in Article 8, a number of information that need to be provided by the supplier to the relevant member states, the transit states, that basically ensures a secured transport. When we have a look at the arms transport by air, then we can rely upon a broader international instrument. This is the Montreal Convention. The Montreal Convention was drafted in 1999, and the aim was to replace the so-called Warsaw System. The Warsaw System comprised of the Warsaw Convention that was drafted in 1929. And of course, given the age of the Warsaw System, the Warsaw Convention, a lot of protocols came afterwards. But only a few member states to the Warsaw Convention ratified all the protocols that came afterwards. So the situation was quite unpredictable in a way that you never knew whether the member state to the Warsaw Convention, in fact, also ratified one of the protocols, like the Hague Protocol or the Guatemala City Protocol. The Montreal Convention harmonizes all of these protocols and the Warsaw Convention, and has now 136 member states plus the European Union. Given the fact that the European Union is a member to the Montreal Convention, all member states are, of course, also bound to the Montreal Convention. The application scope is a bit more complex with regards to the international route, because basically it has to be from one member state to another. Also here, of course, the dangerous goods regulation come into play, but also only for loaded arms, basically. So we have internationally the Chicago Convention and Annex 18, and the technical instruction for safe transport of dangerous goods by air would be relevant. We also have industry standards like the IATA Dangerous Goods Resolution, but in general, there is the same baseline as for transport by road. Sorry, apologies. When it comes to the provisions on the transit regulation, the air transport is quite well equipped, to say it like this, because the Article 4.6 Annex 17 of the Chicago Convention provides for the so-called secured transport chain. So the member states must ensure that there is a supply chain security process. This includes screening and security controls. But this secured transport chain applies to every single type of cargo. So there's nothing unique about arms transport in this sense. And this is basically then the foundation we have also for all the security measures for the transport. We also have regional non-legislative acts like the EU Commission regulation, where in CAT-Gen MPA 155, very technical, approval must be given to the transport, and the approval is necessary by all states whose airspace is intended to be used for the flight, and where approval has been granted, storage requirements are in place. So this means arms must be stowed in the aircraft in a place that is inaccessible to the passengers during the flight. In case of firearms, the firearms must be unloaded, and there must be a notification of the commander about details and location of the arms on board and where they are located in the aircraft. I briefly touched upon it in the agenda. The multimodal arms transport can be a problem because, as I said, the transport conventions only apply to a transport by one specific transport means. What they do not specify is the scope of their application, because usually they only provide rules on the liability, meaning from taking over to delivery, or in case of the Montreal Convention, during the period during which the cargo is in charge of the carrier. But there is a lot of interpretation and room for interpretation. Why is this problematic? It is problematic because of the limited liability for the carrier under the Montreal Convention. The carrier in general is only liable to a limited amount. But in case of the Montreal Convention, there is no exception from this rule, even in case of intent. So even if employees or the carrier himself steals the weapons or take them away deliberately, these limits will stay. So this means we have remaining uncertainties for the transport conventions, at least for the scope of the transport conventions, whereby the transit regulations are more or less certain because they go along for the entire voyage. Thank you very much for the opportunity to speak, for your attention, and yeah, thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Herrlich, for a very insightful and interesting and at times technical presentation. But I think that we can all benefit from the presentation that you made. I would like to open the floor while we still have Dr. Herrlich online for any questions that you might have for her. Match for Peace is the first one. You have the floor.
I should like to thank the facilitator of the session, and I should like to thank the working group on item 9. Regarding item 9, which is transit and reshipment, we should like to underscore what was contained in the article, that is the practical side and the measures needed to control the whole transit operation. We would like to underscore, Aidan, in view of your question, how do countries organize transit and reshipment? We should like to say that the entities that organize and govern all these operations are through the rules. However, this is uncertain in many situations. For example, in Yemen, there are many operations of arms transport between the Houthis and Iran that are not subjected to any controls. This is also coupled with violations of IHL. For example, there were boats found carrying certain arms which were marked or labeled by Iranian language. Moreover, similar writings were found on drones and other weapons. We would like to shed the light on the importance that the international community and the member states to encourage countries to be committed and fulfill the laws and regulations of transport, as well as taking into consideration the recommendations and proposals submitted by the working group. And we look forward to following this subject in the next meeting. Thank you.
Thank you, Pat. I think Ghana is next on the list. Ghana, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Mr. Facilitator. And let me congratulate you for the wonderful work you've done so far. Considering your rich experience, long experience in the implementation of the ATT, I have no doubt that you are the man for this particular topic, Article 9. Let me also thank the presenter for that wonderful presentation. Especially, I was very much enthused by her understanding of the transfer of goods or dangerous goods by road. If colleagues have been following, recently we in Ghana have just experienced a huge explosion as a result of mining explosives, which happened in a small village called Apiache, where a whole village was wiped off as a result of an explosion by a vehicle transporting mining explosive. We recorded quite considerable number of casualties and death as a result. I have taken a look at your document, the Annex A, particularly on the regional instruments, and I've seen the reference to, especially in ECOWAS, Convention regulating interstate road transportation between ECOWAS member states, and Convention relating to interstate road transit by goods in 1982 in ECOWAS. I didn't see the reference to the ECOWAS Convention on Small Arms and Light Weapons, which actually regulates transfer of small arms and light weapons, their ammunition, parts and components in ECOWAS. So if you take the ECOWAS Convention, particularly the interpretation section, when you talk about transfer, it defines transfer as import, export, transit, transshipment, and transportation. So it means that the ECOWAS Convention regulates transportation of small arms and light weapons in ECOWAS. And if you come to Article 3 of the Convention, it bans the transfer of small arms and light weapons within the ECOWAS region. And the transfer of such small arms and light weapons is subject to the ECOWAS exemption regime. So the two regional instruments mentioned are very relevant, but we wish to note that they are subject to the ECOWAS Convention, which restricts the movement or the transportation of small arms and light weapons and makes it subject to the ECOWAS Convention. I thank you, Mr. Facilitator.
Thank you to the distinguished delegate of Ghana and the comments directed to me as facilitator, much appreciated. On the issue of the ECOWAS Convention, we did not look at specifically on arms in compiling the annex to the background paper. So we didn't look at the goods, but the mode of transport. So from that perspective, we have in Southern Africa the SADC protocol. There's East Africa and the Horn that has one. There's several of these instruments on specifically on arms, conventional arms, in other regions as well, that do have regulations on transport, transit and transshipment encapsulated. Dr. Hernich, if you're still on the line, I'd like to give you the floor if you would like to respond to any of these two comments made, while others may still reflect and wish to take the floor. So you have the floor.
Yeah, thank you very much. Thank you very much for the comments. I'd like to take them in the same order. So you mentioned that there were different languages in the labelings. Maybe I can respond to this. This is a common problem. I mean, that's a practical problem, of course. We see this in transport. Well, I'm mainly doing transport for non-military goods, and I worked also in this field. It is always handy to have a translator in place, because this is just a common problem, and there is, to my knowledge at least, no standard regarding you need to use, or you are required to use English language, or you are required to use one language of the United Nations. But this is all I can say about this. Regarding the ECOWAS convention, thank you very much for the comment. I had a look into this briefly, and my apologies that it did not appear at the presentation. But what I saw was that it mainly refers to the transport from a regulatory perspective, and not what I mentioned, the transport law in its classic sense. And that's why I kept this quite brief. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Heinrich. Yes, that clarifies it, and much the same that I see it as well. That we don't those specific conventions that have been excluded look specifically at arms, and as you say, from a regulatory point of view, to prevent diversion. I would like to invite, if there are any more questions or comments for Dr. Heinrich. I do not see anyone. Dr. Heinrich, if I may just confirm, are you going to be on the line for the next 55 minutes or so?
I can be on the line if I'm required to. That's no problem.
Thank you. So, dear colleagues, Dr. Heinrich, while you're reflecting on the comments that might be raised from the floor, and there's something that you specifically wish to direct to her, please feel free to do so. As I said, the discussion this afternoon will take place within the framework of the multi-year work plan. And we are turning to the third and fourth topics of that work plan. Before I carry on, you all have the background paper with its annex with you. There are just two minor edits that I need to point out. On topic 4, in question 1B, the last word should read air and not road. Then in the annex, in paragraph 3, the last subparagraph, Dr. Heinrich also referred there to the Chicago Convention, and there's a typo there, typographical error, which it reads 1994, it should read 1944. So there's a bit of a difference in the number of years. I would like to start off our discussion this afternoon on topic 3 and topic 4 by looking first at topic 3 and taking the two questions together, because I would imagine that in terms of the national regulations that you have as states parties, and that may be the focus of our NGO partners as well, which the first one states, how do states regulate the transit and transshipment of arms by road in practice? And the second question as by rail in practice. And then there are, specifically at the respective national levels, there are sub-questions as well. I'm not going to read them out. You have that with you. So I invite comments, and then B, which government departments and agencies regulate these measures by road and rail. And that's an easy one to respond to as you are making your intervention. And those are issues that will help us in our further work in looking at some voluntary guideline that we can develop. So the floor is open if anyone wishes to make an intervention on this particular matter. Oh, Cameroon.
Merci de me passer la parole.
Thank you very much for giving me the floor in the name of the delegation of Cameroon. This delegation speaking for the first time. We would like to thank President Goebel for the activities that he's undertaken since the beginning of his presidency. We'd also like to thank the Secretariat, the ATT Secretariat, for the welcome here in Geneva and the organization of this meeting. We would also like to thank our moderator, Mr. Wensley, who is working with us for the second phase. Also, our thanks to Ambassador Gomez, who spoke to us on Articles 6 and 7. Cameroon followed this with great interest, and insofar as possible, we will submit in writing our comments concerning the voluntary guide on Articles 6 and 7. It's also an opportunity to thank Dr. Herning, who has spoken to us about the situations of transit by road and by air, because all that we have heard here can help us at the national level, because in Cameroon, we are at a phase where we have a national law for general governance of arms, and the necessary parliamentary measures are under discussion at present. So everything that's being said here will be very useful to us at the national level. Now, referring to the working document that has been submitted to us, in the governmental actors who come into play in fields of transit are threefold. Requests for transit are usually addressed to the presidency, going through the External Relations Ministry that routes the request, and the implementation of the authorization, when it is granted, is then given by the Ministry of Defense. Apart from our national text, which defines a transit, the Kinshasa Convention on light weapons, light and small caliber weapons, also foresees the issue of transfer of weapons. And in Article 3, states authorize transfer only if it is justified for maintaining order or national defense, or at the time of participation in peacekeeping forces. Cameroon, on a bilateral basis, has agreements with the states like Chad and Central African Republic for the transport of goods. We could also add that in a re-export, Cameroon only authorizes this with the agreement of the initial exporting state, which contributes to the non-waylaying of weapons. That's what we'd like to say for the first intervention on Article 9. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Cameroon.
Merci, Cameroun, pour votre intervention. Je vois que notre collègue du Ghana demande la parole. Elle est à vous. Merci.
Give me the floor once again. I will not bore you with too much words. I'll go straight to answering the questions. I believe that will make your work a bit more simpler. So let me take question 1. How do states regulate transit and transshipment of arms by road in practice? For us in Ghana, it's usually regulated by the ECOWAS Convention on Small Arms and Light Weapons. This makes small arms and light weapons, or arms in general, not general goods, but these are restricted goods that are regulated by specific convention. So the transfer of small arms and light weapons is actually regulated by the ECOWAS Convention. And I've already stated the definition of transfer in the ECOWAS Convention, which include transportation, transit, and transshipment, import, export as well. And I've also stated that under Article 3 of the ECOWAS Convention, this transfer within the region is actually banned. So it means that before you can even transport small arms and light weapons within the ECOWAS region, you need what we call the exemption certificate issued by ECOWAS. And that is when all the member states, a request has been sent to all the member states. And once ECOWAS doesn't receive any objection from any of the member states, it goes ahead to give you what we call the exemption certificate to transfer such weapons within the sub-region. We don't have specific law on transfer of arms by rail, but once again, it's guided by the issue of transfer as elaborated in the ECOWAS Convention. At the national level, once the weapons gets within the jurisdiction of a member state, the member state now uses its own national laws to guide the regulation or the movement of the arms by whichever means, by road or by rail. So for instance, if a landlocked country in West Africa, in the ECOWAS region, transit or ships its arms within Ghana, once the weapons or the arms get into Ghana, the first request will be to look at the ECOWAS exemption regime. Once there is an ECOWAS exemption certificate and it gets within the jurisdiction of Ghana, Ghana will now employ its national law to transit the weapons out of its jurisdiction. So what happens is that the arms are transported by road under guard and the police guard from the point of entry to the point of exit. So which government agency? Usually this, we will need a permit to transport these items or the arms out of Ghana, and this permit is actually issued by the Ministry of Interior, and then it's given conditions. One of the main conditions is that it has to be transported under police guard out of the jurisdiction. So once it gets out of the jurisdiction, it's handed over to the partner countries or the sister country, and we have finished our work in that regard. So as the Ministry of Interior, with the support of the Ghana Police Service, that does the transportation of the arms within the jurisdiction of Ghana. The main instrument, or original instrument, as I've already indicated, is the ECOWAS Convention on Small Arms and Light Weapons. And it's the same instrument that guides or that regulates transit and transshipment of arms by road. In terms of free trade, of free movement of goods, as I've already indicated, weapons or arms are restricted goods. They are not subject to the principles of free trade and are subject to specific conventions or treaties within the sub-region. I thank you very much, Mr. Facilitator.
Thank you, Ghana. I'm just a little, if I may, we can have an interactive discussion here, please, because I just want to clarify in my own mind. So let's take a practical example here. South Africa wants to export, or Ghana wants to import arms from South Africa. There's a need for something that you do. So who does the application process? Does that go to ECOWAS, the ECOWAS Secretariat? But does it start there, or does it start with, say, your country, Ghana, applying to the ECOWAS Secretariat for an exemption? And the Secretariat will obviously circulate that to the ECOWAS members. So how does who starts off? Do I start off with the ECOWAS Secretariat, or do I start off with the Ghanaian government? If you can just, what comes first, the chicken or the egg? Just to clarify it in my own mind, if you could please.
Thank you very much, Mr. Facilitator. The request has to go to the ECOWAS Secretariat. You make a formal request, the country makes a formal request to the ECOWAS Secretariat with details of the type of arms it wants to import and who and which country they intend to import these weapons from. When that application gets to the ECOWAS Secretariat, the ECOWAS Secretariat now writes to all the member states that country A wants to import these weapons. Do you have any objection? ECOWAS Secretariat will give timelines in which countries are supposed to raise objections. Once the ECOWAS Secretariat doesn't receive any objection, it goes ahead to issue what we call the exemption certificate to the country to now import those weapons. I hope that clarifies it, Mr. Facilitator.
It does, because the forerunner of the ECOWAS Convention was, of course, the ECOWAS Declaration. And when I dealt with that, and it's a very brief declaration, actually, and when I dealt with that some years ago, on small arms and light weapons, by the way, I wasn't quite clear if it's the importing state or the exporting state, but you've clarified the ECOWAS importing state needs to do the application to the Secretariat before it can formally, should I say, contract and transfer the goods. Thank you very much for that clarification. Next on my list, I have Zambia, followed by Romania. Zambia, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Mr. Facilitator, for the wonderful job on the background paper that you have presented for us. As a country, I think this applies more for us because we're a land-linked country where a lot of transit take place, including those involving arms, and mainly the Customs Department in the forefront of making sure that all transits of arms are done according to regulations. What takes place mainly that each transiting state that wants to pass through Zambia has to make a formal application through the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, which will in turn then submit such a request to the Ministry of Defense for clearance, and then documentation has to be presented well before the arms even reach the entry point of any of the borders where the transit is first taking place. And then In these declarations, it has to state the type of arms that they want to transit through Zambia, the amounts, the type of transportation. So all that paperwork has to be in order. And then once it reaches the entry point, normally we provide the security. The people who are transiting cannot just pass through. So we give them a military escort from the point of entry to the point of exit. This is to avoid the arms being diverted within our jurisdiction. And also the trucks or whatever form of transportation that is being used is tagged and monitored and given a timeline to transit within the point of entry to the point of exit, failure to which there will be some penalties that may take place. So this paper, mainly for us, it was very timely because a lot of transit normally take place. It might be maybe by importing states or maybe states that are passing through with their own military cargo, maybe for either SADC exercise or maybe some peacekeeping mission in the neighboring countries. Thank you.
Thank you to our colleague from Zambia. Next on my list is Romania. You have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Facilitator. On behalf of the Romanian delegation, allow me to express my gratitude for your work have done so far. I would like to share briefly some aspects of national relevance related to transit and transshipment. Regarding transfer, we had a definition in our national export control legislation, and it is the transport of military goods through the Romanian territory originating from or intended to another country. According to the legislation, the legal person has to register with the national authority to carry out operations with military goods and apply for a transit license prior to transaction. All operations with military goods, including transit and transshipment, shall be carried out only through designated customs offices set out in documents issued by the national authority. These customs offices are authorized for operations with military goods by the customs authority. By law, the Authority for Export Controls has 30 days to issue a transit license. In practice, the assessment of a transit license application includes verification of the following documents: agreement or contract between the applicant and the beneficiary of the international transit or transshipment services, a copy of the export license or an equivalent document issued by the national authorities within the exporter's country, the import license or an equivalent document issued by the national authorities within the importer's country, a copy of the invoice, the contact details of foreign partners, the packing list, details about the means of transportation and the person accompanying the consignment, transit or transshipment license or an equivalent document issued by the national authorities within the neighboring country where the goods will enter after exit Romania, and documents attesting that the measures to guard and secure the consignment have been taken. In some cases, we also require the contract number for the Romanian Gendarmerie escort services. The Romanian legal entity who obtained the transit license has the obligation to inform the Export Control Authority in maximum 10 days that the export operation has ended. There are some exemptions to these export control provisions, and that is when the legal operations are performed in connection with the participation of foreign armed forces or law enforcement structures from abroad, having the approval of the Romanian authorities for transit through Romania. And also the provision of the export control regime do not apply to a transit when it is related to a transfer of military goods between European Union member states. The same rules apply for transshipment. The only difference is that the transshipment has a different definition and is the operation of unloading military goods from one transport vector, followed by reloading into another transport vector during transit operations or during the entrance or exit operation in or from the Romanian territory. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
I thank our distinguished colleague from Romania, and I now give the floor to the delegation of Barbados. Do you have the floor?
Mr. Facilitator, I am deeply honored to be here in Geneva, to be able to speak on behalf of the government and people of Barbados. I want to thank the President and staff of the ATT for the excellent work in putting this meeting together. With respect to Article 9, much has been said about transit and transshipment of arms by land and air. Nothing has been said about transit or transshipment by sea. As an island state, most of our commerce is done by sea. I was just wondering if there's a separate article dealing with transit or transshipment by sea. Thank you.
Thank you to our colleague from Barbados. Indeed, it's a very important aspect, and that is going to be addressed in our April session as a separate item rather than here. Is there any other request? Sorry, I can't read that far. Okay, I believe Switzerland is first. So Switzerland, you have the floor.
Thank you, Facilitator, for the preparation of this sub-working group. And also a warm thank you to Dr. Julia Hörnig for the very interesting introduction. Let me try to answer some of your questions, Mr. Facilitator, from our national perspective. The transit and transshipment of arms and its ammunition by land is subject to authorization under Swiss national arms control legislation. No distinction is made between transit by road and transit by rail. The licensing requirements and the licensing conditions are the same for both types of transport. The application for transit and transshipment of arms by land is assessed by the National Licensing Authority in consultation with the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and together with other agencies, depending on the content of the application. The control at the border lies in the responsibility of the Customs Authority. It plays an important role as it is empowered to check the goods and the transport documents of an arms transit and transshipment. If the Customs Authority finds irregularities during the check, it informs the National Licensing Authority. The Licensing Authority then carries out appropriate clarifications together with the Customs Authority and other stakeholders, such as the exporting party or the importing party. In principle, every arms transit and transshipment requires a license. However, Switzerland has made provisions to facilitate certain transits, for instance, concerning border crossings for sporting or hunting events, or members of foreign military or police forces for training-related journeys. Thank you very much, Mr. Facilitator.
Thank you for that, Switzerland. Yes, I think most of our countries follow a very similar approach to yours. Next on my list is Georgia. You have the floor, madam.
Good afternoon. I want to thank the Secretariat for organizing this preparatory meeting and wish them all the best. In Georgia, the Ministry of Defense is authorized organization that issues licensing and permits. As a licensing officer, I always take into account whether the documents are authentic. I mean export license, import license, and end-user certificate. My colleague was talking about translation problems of documents. I want to note that we always require the documents which are confirmed and translated by the authorized organizations or agencies. The transit licenses always are regulated at the national law. Thank you.
Thank you, Georgia. Next on my list is Control Arms. You have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Facilitator. Control Arms welcomes the agenda and discussion points within the context of this sub-working group on Article 9. We appreciate the presentation provided today by Dr. Julia Hornig and the insights provided by several states already today. Of course, we're very interested in learning more from other states about their insights on this important topic of transit and transshipment by land and air as they relate to the movement of conventional weapons, and indeed to what extent states distinguish whether or not there are multiple transport modalities. By providing additional detailed questions in its background paper, Sub-Working Group on Article 9 presents a solid framework for states parties to submit their positions and their questions as to how these international and regional instruments relate to national state practice and ultimately ATT compliance. This discussion is particularly relevant to states, parties and signatories whose role centers on transit and transshipment. As it moves forward this year, Control Arms urges the sub-working group to explore fully the relationship between Article 9 and the Article 6 and 7, as such an exploration will shed light on how to approach national control system development for transit and transshipment in particular, and what baselines are required in practice to ensure compliance with ATT obligations. Control Arms is especially interested in hearing states parties' insights on commonalities and differences between national export licensing processes and transit transshipment licensing processes, and how to ensure these two processes are consistent and build on one another. Finally, given the crossover between subject matter of this working group and the sub-working group on Article 11, which this year is focusing on the role of transit and transshipment, Control Arms suggests collaboration between the sub-working groups, including a joint session of these two sub-working groups. Combining these discussions will serve to strengthen both sub-working groups and provides an opportunity to ensure the coherence of implementation among treaty provisions. Thank you very much, Mr. Facilitator.
Thank you. Is there anyone else who wishes to take the floor? Any other delegation? I believe the Fair Trade Group also wishes to make an intervention. You have the floor.
Thank you very much, Mr. Rosalie, and
ladies and gentlemen, distinguished delegates. The Fair Trade Group, the Firearms and Ammunition Import-Export Roundtable, are importers and exporters that deal with the regulations and the movement of arms and ammunition on a daily basis. That's what we do. And we welcome the opportunity to share our experience to lead to an efficient and effective treaty. A couple of issues that have come up related to implementation of the ATT, and particularly in the air and sea modalities, is what happens when a vessel is diverted because of emergency weather or to pick up another cargo that was unknown at the time the vessel left the initial port, and there is no permit in the country for which that vessel lands to address the concern. And some sort of a methodology that would allow for that reality without a confiscation or fines would be extremely helpful. And we would look forward to working with you to come up with a solution to that very real situation that has already occurred several times. The other thing we'd point out is in terms of the shipment, there is a very robust UN transportation group that creates the model regulations for shipment, particularly of ammunition and ammunition components under what's called the Purple Book and the Orange Book. And that does provide under the GHS, the Global Harmonized System, appropriate and multinational language representations to identify the potential risk from that shipment. Also dictates what kind of packaging would be acceptable, and any future efforts in this regard within the ATT would also need to incorporate or be consistent with those other UN programs. So again, the Fair Trade Group looks forward to providing a real world experience to help shape an effective treaty. And thank you very much.
Thanks to the Fair Trade Group, you posed some very interesting and tricky questions, I must say, for us to look into. I see Mexico has requested the floor. You have the floor, sir.
Gracias, señor.
Thank you, Chair. I will be very brief. We believe that the working document that you have very kindly shared with us is very useful and is extremely important that we can examine the role and responsibilities of private companies that deal with arms trade and the agents and other brokering measures. The legislation we have in our country gives all responsibility to the transport of these weapons in the Ministry of Defense as the central authority, which has really been very positive because of a lack of accidents or incidents that we have seen. Thank you.
Thank you, Mexico. Is there any other delegation that wishes to take the floor? Mauritania, you have the floor.
Thank you, sir. I take this opportunity to thank President Goebel, His Excellency Ignacio Hernandez, Mr. Winsley as a moderator, and Mr. Dlala, the head of the Secretariat, as well as all of the staff of the Secretariat. I've noticed that we've had a roundtable on the various issues at hand, and this is something that's very positive. What we are talking about is very important, but there is another phenomenon that has not been alluded to, and I would like to refer to the fact that, well, of course, the socio-cultural aspects come into play, but in certain countries, and I'm talking about my continent in particular, Africa, and possibly in other continents, there is the artisanal manufacturing of weapons, which is gaining in importance. And this is something that has to be taken into consideration. It has to be fully analyzed. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you for that, for your intervention. Is there any other delegation that wishes to take the floor? We don't see any. Just in my national capacity, the agency that looks at arms transfers by whatever means, as Switzerland has also said, whatever method of transport, is the body is the National Conventional Arms Control Committee. It was set up in post-apartheid era, 1995. It consists of cabinet ministers, and the interesting part that I've picked up, and I have picked up over the years, that in a lot of countries that aren't major traders in arms, the prominence of the Ministry of Defense is quite interesting. In our case, the chairman of it consists of cabinet ministers, including defense, my own foreign ministry, which is now called the Department of International Relations and Cooperation, which takes a long time to write out when you can't just write foreign affairs. And then the intelligence community, Department of Trade and Industry, etc. There are a few others. Now, the chair of our committee, for instance, may not have direct line function responsibility. So it cannot be trade and industry, and it cannot be defense, although those ministers do serve on the committee. They have an input, but they cannot be the final judge and arbiter. It's a check and balance that was written into the system, and it was created just prior to the enactment of the National Conventional Arms Act, with its regulations, and those, should I say, cascade down into the various aspects of the implementation of the Act. So the applications go to the Defense Secretariat, which is kind of separate from Defense. It is a secretariat actually to the Conventional Arms Committee. It serves the committee. It doesn't serve the Department of Defense as such. And some of you may not know, the man sitting next to me was at some point the head of the Secretariat in South Africa, Mr. Dumisani Dladla. So he has a wealth of experience in dealing with this particular aspect as well. Before I do a wrap up, I want to give the floor to Dr. Hernich. If you want to come in and make a comment, observation on any of the interventions made thus far. Dr. Hernich?
Yes, thank you very much. I would like to comment on two aspects fair trade mentioned, and that relates to the type of package and the deviation. I know that I didn't speak about sea transport, but I mean, I can at least provide some information. From a transport law perspective, deviation is only allowed if deviation is reasonable. So, but this is a broad term. Otherwise, it leads to liability. The type of package, all the regulations I saw so far relate to a very vague requirement, basically stating that it shall protect the goods and other goods along the journey and protect them from any harm. So I think within this broad term, there are a lot of possibilities to cover up goods, but it's definitely not specified from what I know. This is all I can say. And of course, also, I think the delegate from Switzerland mentioned it. The transit regulation, I think, are quite common in the sense that they do not specify, or that they do not make a distinction between the different transport modes. And this is just a problem we face in private law. So when we have a problem with the transshipment itself, so there may be eventually a problem. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Herne. I actually also, the same question came up in my mind from the Fair Trade Group, and you say the deviation in I would imagine the route can only be done if it is a reasonable, if there's a reasonable reason behind it. And actually, that was what I was thinking too, because I thought, what constitutes an emergency? Why should the vessel or the truck or whatever you call it deviate? What constitutes a reasonable reason for that emergency to give rise to that sort of situation? But we'll have to deal with that way down the line. I believe Asa wants to take the floor. You have the floor.
Merci, Monsieur le Facilitateur.
Thank you, Mr. Moderator. Once again, we would like to congratulate congratulate the sub-working group for the excellent work that has been done and the documents that have been prepared. We had a question relating to transit. A question for Julia Hoenig, and the question is as follows. Annex E of the Tokyo Convention, is it relevant regarding Article 9 of the ATT? Thank you.
Thank you very much for the question. I think I need to provide you with the answer in writing later on.
Thank you, Dr. Herne. I believe the Fair Trade Group wants to come back on the discussion here. So you have the floor, sir.
Oh, thank you very much. And just wanted to clarify on the packaging requirements under UN transport laws. There are very specific tests that are required to classify a product, and depending on the results of those tests depends on the kind of packaging. And there are other tests of the product in that packaging, such as, for instance, the 6D test, to verify that should there be a fire, for example, that the product does not create a risk to people nearby. And we just need to make sure that the regulations and whatever requirements are put in place with the Arms Trade Treaty don't undermine those basic safety requirements. The other aspect that I'd like to clarify is the reasons for potential diversions, and those could be weather related. It can be an equipment failure on the vessel. particularly in aircraft, but also within seagoing vessels. And I understand that will be a subject for later meetings. But in the case of seagoing vessels in particular, you can have a vessel leaving port A with all the proper documentation to arrive at port B, but in the process, while that ship is at sea, the company can get a call from a large customer in port C that is not on the permits for weapons or ammunition that may also be on board. And that ship would then divert to port C to pick up those additional cargoes. Would have absolutely nothing to do with the arms or ammunition, but you now have arms and ammunition on a vessel in a port in a country which was not part of the original paperwork. And so that creates confusion and a challenge to the lawful, completely lawful movement of legal products. Thank you.
Thank you to the Free Trade Group. Indeed, it seems as though these emergencies are more relevant to the issue of transit and transshipment by sea. I can't read. Philippines, you have the floor, sir.
Sorry. Excellencies, distinguished delegates, ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon. We'd like to thank the moderator, Mr. Wensley, and of course, Mr. Dadla of the Secretariat for all the efforts just to ensure that there will be a smooth flow the discussion of this forum. Of course, to Dr. Hornig, who had presented a very impressive presentation. The issues raised by our guy from Mr. Patterson is very real and must be addressed by the Arms Trade Treaty as a convention. But my question is simple for Dr. Hornig. In the later part of her presentation, she was mentioning about loaded, the word loaded. May I ask a clarification on this terminology? Is it firearms being loaded with ammunition being transported, or what else? Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Philippines. Colleagues, I see we're running short of time. You do know that there's a virtual session by the chair at 4:15. So if we can try and wrap up. Dr. Henrich, could you briefly respond to the question posed by the Philippines?
Yes, thank you very much. I had a problem with the audio. Could you please, so I understood that you asked for a clarification regarding the transshipment and unloading and loading. Was this correct? Because I was not entirely sure.
Philippines, could you just clarify that again, please?
There was mention of the word loaded. I'm just asking for a clarification of what does the word loaded mean? Does it mean firearms being loaded with ammunition being carried around the territory or something? Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. It means if the arm is carrying ammunition. So if the arm is in fact, or if the arms becomes dangerous in a way. So that the arm itself, the light weapon can itself be dangerous because it is explosive. This does not apply if ammunition is not on board or ammunition is not inside the weapon. This is what I meant with loaded.
Thank you, Dr. Henrich. I see the Philippines is nodding, so that satisfies his question. Just very briefly before I close, I just want to come back to the point made by Control Arms on the relationship between this sub-working group and the others. Yes, we will get to that. That is, if you look at the multi-year work plan, it is one of our final items that I thought it might be appropriate for the chair of the working group to actually pull that together. But if it's, you know, if he approves our work plan as well. So we will get to that issue. Quite a few of you have mentioned the issue of transit and transshipment of arms by sea. So that'll be our next topic, as well as the role of private sector. That wasn't me. So we have 3 hours for that. But in the meantime, I see quite a few of you actually read your presentations from your laptops. We would appreciate very much if you could give us your inputs in writing. Even if you didn't make a prepared input today, it'll greatly facilitate our work if you can give that to us in writing in order to put together the elements of some voluntary guide as we go through our work in this multi-phase program. So in April, we will go to the transit and transshipment by sea. In the meantime, you've got homework to do. Is there anyone else that wishes to make a final comment, or can we wrap up? From your side? Okay, I don't see any other request for the floor. I'd like to thank you all, as well as to Dr. Hernich for a very insightful presentation. And we'll see each other tomorrow in this room, but I won't be sitting here. I'll be sitting in the rafters. So I thank you. This meeting is adjourned.